Everyone. My name is Alicia Boyd. I go by she, her pronouns. Thank you to all the organizers for putting Queer and AI workshop together, and thank you for all the reviewers and their hard work organizing. These are my wonderful collaborators working on this paper. Um, they are amazing people, and also it tells a little bit of history of where we're coming from with this particular paper. We're coming from legal background, also NLP and critical studies theories, all trying to figure out how in the world can we be more proactive in this space of to mitigate the harms to the queer community. So our presentation outline is as follows: a little bit of introduction, motivation, talking about reflexivity and the different harms that we are pointing out, and finally our conclusion where we have a call to action. So what influences AI fairness policy in US? We have legal protections, we have also the academics and industry, and we have this machine learning technology. And all these things are, are segueing into one another. However, there's with our conversations among ourselves as collaborators, we're not really finding how there's a lot of gaps within these different different spaces, and we want to be proactive in this space as far as the safety and the fairness that is there. So we care about policy and how it's implemented because it impacts the different harms. There's different harms that's impacted onto these communities. We learned that NLP technologies are they have harms that propagated into these different systems, and also when from a legal policy, there's not enough legal protections that protect vulnerable communities, and what is that recourse to mitigate these different harms. So we want to be more proactive instead of reactive with these different harms. We want to introduce things like reflexivity to ask, so researchers, policymakers, and also academics can think about how can we safeguard and protect, be more vigilant with protecting these different communities, especially in terms of NLP technologies. So we go to the social sciences such as and look for critical theories, in particularly reflexivity, to really take a proactive approach, thinking about how are these NLP technologies mitigating, causing harm, and is there a way that we can step back and try to prevent these different harms. So we want to identify legal gaps for protecting queer bodies. And we also want to empower people that reflexivity is a way that we can think about how can we use our power and position to mitigate these different harms. So we go to a paper which really goes through in detail about how, what are the experiences, the queer experiences impacting queer people, and particularly with gender non-affirmative, non-affirmative harms, and then body policing and gender binaryism. So these are the three different harms that we're going to point out in the paper. And also we're going to talk about the legal gaps that are missing to that's not protecting these different communities, and also showing reflexive questions on what we can do to think about how can we do better, what are some ways to prevent some of these harms. So with gender non-affirmation, here is a picture where Chat GPT is not, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. Um, uh, so this is an example of gender non-affirmation, misgendering example. For instance, in healthcare, uh, there's outdated terminology to refer to trans people, and therefore not getting the representative care. They're not feeling seen. So also with erasure examples, not using the correct pronouns and not realizing that they is in a singular pronoun, nor using neopronouns. So these are some examples that we talk about in the paper about forms of erasure. And from a legal context, looking at the legal lens and seeing what is being said about gender non-affirmation. And again, legal protections for queer people are often lacking and fragile. Also, the latest decision with the Supreme Court, not really considering queer people as people. So some of the questions that we want to ask ourselves, reflexive questions, is to talk about specific attitudes and assumptions that people hold about gender binary, and thinking about also gender influence and methodology approaches when you're performing NLP task of asking questions of who is harmed, who benefits the most. And the critical vigilance piece, how can we not reaffirm binary genders, and how do we make it more inclusive to those that do not ascribe to a gender? And how can we think about the different NLP tasks to not reinforce these binary norms? Now moving on to body gender policing and NLP examples, bioessentialism when it comes to large language models, and then over penalizing content moderation of queer content. So here's one example, and then from a legal context, again, going through and looking at different acts where NLP language can be quite offensive and be used. And then also there is some legal definitions when it comes to sex trafficking and enabling sex traffickers, which often mischaracterize the LGBTQ plus communities and individuals. So again, returning back to the reflexive questions, how coming from like a personal epistemological and then a critical vigilance questions, we ask ourselves, how may I consider TG and B content as inappropriate? When is it not actually sexually explicit? How can the design choices within building NLP technologies replicate observed forms of gender fixation or evaluation? As a practitioner looking at content moderation, how do I support the wellness of transgender and non-binary communities in NLP-driven context moderation? A third example, as far as reinforcement of gender binary examples, is again privileging cis bodies. And then again, when it comes to safety and privacy, you don't want to out. So again, thinking about how these NLP technologies are not designed for those that are located on the margins, and always focusing on the dominant spheres. So again, what can we do with these NLP technologies to better protect and have a safe space for queer people. So this slide is a lot when it comes to the legal context of what's out there with gender binaryism. In short, there's not that much discussion, only in terms of like the Fair Housing Act, but still there's still different legal protections, federal protections that are lacking, and you have to depend on state level, um, rely on state governments to do something. So with these different gaps, it doesn't really guarantee the safety and privacy for queer communities. So again, going back to reflexive questions, what are some ways that, again, we should not privilege cis bodies, and thinking about those that are located on the margins. So asking questions like, what is your understanding of gender binary reflected in NLP technologies? How are there some ways that we can dismantle that different thinking? Also, coming from a practitioner point of view, what are some ways that we can protect transgender and non-binary individuals from being outed from the technology that is created? So are there safeguards that you can be proactive with instead of being reactive after the technologies cause harms to individuals? So in conclusion, we're trying to just call to action and really bring these groups of technologists, policymakers into being proactive with our decisions with when these NLP technologies are created. How can we safeguard and protect these different communities? So we have to think about incorporating reflexivity throughout the process, so we can be critical with our processes and really start to center transgender, non-binary, queer communities, instead of really coming from things from a very dominant mindset that's privileging cis bodies. So this is something that we want to actually step away from and have a reflective posture to better center the most vulnerable. So therefore, we need to think about who is protected, why, who do we need to continue to protect given this current harms, what data is consumed. Also, there's a lot of conversation about how our biases are built into these different NLP technologies. So again, asking ourselves, how can we break that mold? What can we do differently to again center the vulnerable? And thank you so much. If for additional questions and comments, we ask that this is our Elia, they are our contact person for the paper. And any questions or comments?
So I'll start us off with a question. So it seems like in your paper, you talk a lot about US law and kind of where it's lacking in terms of protecting TGMB communities. I wonder, do you know anything about what are other countries doing? Are there other countries doing better? Other countries doing, worse? Could you say a few words about that? Is there any examples we have to go off of?
This is Elia over here. I'm going to jump in for questions. And to answer that, we just want to emphasize the scope of our paper, which was centered on US critical technopolicy approaches. But we do think as a future work that having a kind of contrastive work that looks across several geopolitical contexts are going to be very necessary. So this is just kind of starting out with looking at, especially with knowing that, right, like AI and high resource languages, and in terms of resource distribution, the global north is um, very much a space to start off with looking at what it means to evaluate and be thinking about creating tools with respect to knowing that the tools and the guidance is very much influenced by the policy present in the state. So we do think it's going to be definitely future work that is encouraged and certainly exciting to think about.
Thank you. Absolutely. I really liked how your work highlighted it's not, I guess, just about AI systems, but these other systems in place, that interact with them. Are there any other questions in the room? Thank you.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much for your presentation. This is Lex, by the way. Hello. I think this is so important to everything that you've said today. I think these are such powerful, really crucial reminders. And something I was also thinking about in listening to your presentation is that I completely agree that we do need to be proactive rather than reactive. And another thing that I'm thinking about as well is the way that maybe existing protections could be leveraged in these situations as well, that maybe despite certain aspects of LLM development and NLP technologies being very innovative, that we don't necessarily entirely need to reinvent the wheel here as well, at least in pointing maybe policymakers to the fact that these protections, although they are themselves maybe very limited, also equally apply to AI technologies. And so I was just wondering if that was something that that maybe you considered in your analysis, or something that you have any thoughts on as well.
So yes, we've considered it. It's part of the long road where we have to strategize how to explain these connections to those that may not be familiar with them. So that's like part of the battle that comes with it. Um, but yes, we are trying to make linkages and just try to break down the building blocks for them so they can understand it, especially from a legal policy, and just how these different harms are transcribed into different aspects of these different technologies, and what is the trying to talk about what the strategy looks like coming from different disciplines. I think that's a big strategy that we can do. Gathering computer scientists with social scientists, and then the actual legal components and what that looks like to put all these brains together and to make these different strides to communicate like, hey, these are harms and we need to be proactive with them because we see the reactive harms, and we don't want that. And I think this paper is a really good start of those conversations, and also the foundation to encourage others, saying, hey, let's be reflexive, let's be critically reflexive in our processes and what that looks like, so we can mitigate these harms on the communities located out at the margins.
Just to build off that as well, I think something that is oh, oopsies. So interdisciplinary collaboration's critical, right? I have my own biases. Alicia has her own biases. Everyone here has their own way of thinking about the world, right? We have very specific ways that we're taught how to exercise and perform different tasks, right? And that's what pedagogy centers around, right? That's what the notion of epistemology centers around with respect to different domains. Now, when we think about what currently exists, which was a great question, it's like, how can we be doing better given even if these things are limited? And so we circle back to these interdisciplinary spaces to have these conversations, to be challenging our assumptions and presuppositions. Now, one thing in those conversations, one, we need to be having them more. And two, when people, I think there's kind of a two-pronged number two. One is making sure that there are spaces and incentives to have those conversations and make sure that people across disciplines are seen as valued and their knowledge is valorized. I think it's very, very often that I see that if someone is not considered a machine learning researcher, their knowledge is not considered valid for the machine learning task. That's something that we need to correct, because at the end of the day, if we're going to be creating technologies that interface with society, it's going to be people that we're going to need to understand most. And so when it comes down to this as well, having those conversations, this is kind of the second prong of that number two, it is creating internally ways to create shared vocabulary, right, around what specific things mean. Because I think a lot of times it can also be the fact that like people feel like there's not enough time given, sprint planning, say in an industry setting. It's like, okay, well, we don't have enough time to have these kind of conversations, whatever, XYZ. Okay, it sounds like there needs to be right incentives in place to start streamlining processes and get feedback as to like how exactly do we start to really have these conversations in a way that is fluid, and honestly being vulnerable with, you got to start somewhere and you have to get that feedback and be willing to explore what it means to fail and iterate on that. So I just wanted to go off of Alicia's point.
You couldn't see me, but I was nodding the whole time. So thank you both, folks.
For sure.
All right, thank you. Let's thank our speakers one more time.